everybody. Welcome back to It Is Ma'am. We have a guest today, Ask a Trans Widow, aka Tracy Shannon. Before we have her introduce herself, the housekeeping would just be to check out, Kay created a new Instagram for herself and the podcast. It's really awesome. Check that out. It's in the link tree in both of our bios. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to any and all of the platforms. Tracy, thank you so much for coming. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm Tracy Shannon, and on Twitter, you can find me at Ask a Trans Widow. I've been sharing my story of my experience with the transgender movement for several years now. Just recently, it's gotten more attention after I had an interview on the Michael Knowles show with the Daily Wire. So I'll just start with, I'm a trans widow. Hence the name, Ask a Trans Widow. What that is it's a woman whose husband left to present as a female, thus ending the marriage and walking away from any children. We had a 15-year marriage and 3 children together at the time that he left. And usually people have a lot of questions about that. And so I want to answer some of those questions today while we share this conversation. But I'll start off by saying I first saw what everyone else is seeing over a decade ago. Before Bruce became Caitlin, this movement was already operating stealthily in the United States to allow men into women's spaces and vice versa. Obviously, this movement has more of an effect on women, but it affects families, it affects parental rights, it affects our children. So don't wait for it to be someone in your family to take action to stop this movement, because it's at odds with all of our rights. There are no legitimate rights that can coexist with so-called trans rights. So just want to make that clear. And to illustrate, I'll just share a little bit about my story initially as we get started. And I would say the first time that I saw the teeth of this transgender movement was when I was married to my first husband, before I really understood the nature of this whole thing and the problem he was dealing with, which was cross-dressing. Before I even knew he was really cross-dressing to the extent that he was, we went to a therapist because he admitted he had had a problem in the past with cross-dressing. So after a few incidents early in the marriage and right after the birth of my first son, which is what always seems to happen once a woman's pregnant or has a baby, then the husband then decides it's time for this huge revelation, this issue that is going to be just really destructive to the marriage. They decide, now's the time to come with this big secret. So we went with the big secret to a therapist that he chose. I did not know that he had seen her behind my back. So I'd find out that we weren't going to therapy to address this problem, that we were really going to malign me. And at that therapy session with this therapist who was part of the trans community, an advocate, activist type of psychologist, she told me I was closed-minded because I was not on board with all the cross-dressing. She told me that he should be allowed to go on weekends. This would be a compromise. He would go on weekends with other men, that they would have their girl weekends dressed up. I mean, this sounded like a total gay orgy to me. There was just no way I was going to let this happen. And that he could have like a secret life. As long as I didn't see it, I should be okay with all this. Like, he could go cross-dress certain nights out with the girls, and he would have a PO box, and I would never see the magazines, like women's magazines and like Cosmopolitan and catalogs that would go there. I would not see those. That was her suggestion. And I said, no, I'm not on board with any of that. And she said, well, where did you go to school, meaning college? And I told her I went to Texas A&M University, and the same one that my then husband went to. And it is a pretty conservative school, or it was at the time, as far as universities go. And I don't think I was closed-minded. At the time, I was actually even someone that she would think was open-minded. I was a Democrat voter. I voted for, in the United States, Bill Clinton, I think both times. So I wasn't. I was pretty open-minded to all this stuff. Actually, it's just, but in my marriage, it's a little different territory there. And so she was accusing me of being closed-minded. I was could not understand that. And the next thing she told me was that I was probably a lesbian. You're probably a lesbian because you were attracted to and married a man with this, you know, feminine side, this inner feminine side to him, this inner woman that he wants to express. And so therefore, you know, I might be a lesbian. So she then told us to go to an adult bookstore there in the neighborhood, as we call it locally, which is where the LG back then, no, we weren't even talking about the T, but the LGB, you know, lived down there. Actually kind of neat shops and everything, and neat places to eat in that area. So, but the bookstores were a whole nother thing. I had never seen that type of stuff. I wouldn't say I led a sheltered life, but I did grow up in a Christian family and out in the suburbs of Houston. So I wasn't seeing that kind of stuff. And I was very uncomfortable just being in there with some of the stuff like sex books, and especially in mixed company, male and female. And we got the book, and the book was My Husband, Betty. And that whole thing was just about how really the woman accepted all this, and they would have like dates where it was like they're going to tea together. So this was basically, she gave me this book to read. So she was trying to encourage me to be like this woman and accept all this stuff in my marriage. And by reading just the first little bit of that book, I could tell that this woman who prior to marrying this man had been in a lesbian relationship. So she had a little different mindset anyway going in, even though I don't think that a woman with a man, regardless of how he adorns himself, is actually in a lesbian relationship. I mean, there cannot be a penis in a lesbian relationship just by definition. But I did feel like she would have perhaps been more comfortable than me, a straight woman, in that kind of, you know, scenario. And the therapist did, in fact, later, much later, like in the future when we'd be divorcing, tell my then husband that lesbians were more open to trans women, which is a total lie. We know by talking to lesbians, we know it's just not true. It's like an exception, not the rule, but she presented it as the rule to him. And so did, you know, some other people in his little new network of friends. But we know now that's a lie. I didn't know that then. I didn't have lesbian girlfriends at that time. I was much younger. It's a lot different now with older women. I know a lot more women who are lesbians, and a lot follow me on Ask a Trans Widow. So, you know, and despite that I am a pro-family activist, a lot of lesbians really do like me because they understand that I don't hate them. So it's great to have that mutual understanding that I don't have to support, promote, and celebrate everything you do in order to really like you and care about what happens to you as a woman. So I'm glad that we have that maturity and understanding. But that book was really just propaganda, in my opinion, being given to me to try to tell me this is what I should be like if I want to be a loving wife. And I just said I couldn't be that person that, you know, that I'm reading about. It seemed like the whole relationship started to center around this behavior of his and this new identity he was taking on, and all the pieces changed. I mean, the author even alluded to that. She said she was losing the husband that she married because it was becoming more and more about this personality, and that she was missing that person. And I think anybody who's experienced this, whether your husband is cross-dressing or maybe it's your fiance or boyfriend, but whether your significant other is cross-dressing or is going all the way to present as female, you're missing that old connection. You're missing the relationship that is centered around your heterosexual connection. And instead of him connecting with this elusive other woman he's creating. So there was already, you know, seeing that this trans widow concept was there. There just wasn't a word to describe it back then. And I didn't want to be that woman. I already felt from the little bit of cross-dressing I knew about prior to that, that there was something going on, you know, how women's instincts. I felt like, what's going on here? You know, is it bigger than what I'm seeing on the surface. It felt like cheating. It felt like cheating, but I didn't know how big it was. And I was told by the narcissist that, you know, it's nothing. I'm stressed. I just need to relax. You were stressing me out. You weren't giving me enough affection. So it was my fault. I didn't get what I needed from you. Therefore, you know, because I was lonely or didn't have the kind of affection I wanted, whether that was in the bedroom or out, then I needed to do this. Usually it was to relax. He needed to cross-dress to relax. I did catch him on occasion in the middle of that, but he wasn't fully dressed. Like it would be like shaving or doing some fingernails. And one time when I caught him shaving, he was in a state of arousal. So we can go back to that later. But so I did have this feeling like it was not just relaxing. And there were some things, like some red flag things through the years, but this was pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook, and just kind of in the chat group stage of the internet. So there wasn't as much of all this out there. You know, it definitely wasn't in TV, except for the occasional Jerry Springer or Phil Donahue or something.
Were you in a chat group other than being with that therapist? Did you have other women you were talking with at this time, or were you just kind of dealing with this by yourself?
I did find some women. They were mostly in the United Kingdom, and some were in the US, and it wasn't called trans widows. That wasn't a thing then. It was a Christian support group for women. It was like in a Yahoo group, and it was to support women who are Christian and who are hurt by their husband's cross-dressing. So it was really framed as cross-dressing. There were 2 women in there whose husbands had gone on to have surgeries and present as women full time. And that was just really not going to happen to any of the rest of us, we thought. I mean, it was just so rare. We were just like, that's crazy. One of them, the husband went to live out in San Francisco, I think was like a famous trans activist out there, and did drag and everything else. So that seemed like that would never be happening to me. It wasn't even a possibility. It was more like a joke. One time I asked him, hey, what do you want to be, a woman or something? And he was like, no, that's crazy. And I accepted that. That seemed crazy. It didn't seem like that was a thought in his mind. And I don't really think that that was a thought in his mind, or at least it didn't seem like a possibility. And I didn't know how big his fascination with dressing up was either. I didn't understand it at that time, but I didn't understand even that this was a fetish, and it seemed harmless. I talked to my own mother about the little bit of cross-dressing that I had kind of stumbled onto. And when I use cross-dressing, this feels like a really big term for what I was discovering. I was discovering a little bit of putting on fingernails, a little bit of shaving the chest, a little bit of plucking the eyebrow. I mean, and not necessarily all at the same time. And shaving the legs. There are these things that it just didn't add up. But we would just say it was cross-dressing, even though I didn't ever see him fully dressed. And my own mother was like, well, what harm does it do? And she wasn't meaning that, to deprioritize my feelings or anything. It's just that nobody had a real understanding. Even I didn't have the understanding. I had this feeling that it wasn't right. Like, I couldn't say what was really wrong with it at the time, like how it's really making me feel. And I did in like 1997, before we even had any kids, think about leaving him because of this issue, even before it got bigger. I mean, my gut instinct, I should have maybe trusted it. Of course, then I wouldn't have these wonderful kids. But there was, like, I would say, women, trust your gut. Sometimes we don't, and we are too kind. I think our kindness has been weaponized against us in some ways. And we're told to be open-minded. I tried to be open-minded. There were some things that were a little kinky he was into. And I tried to be open-minded, try anything once. But whenever he said, let's dress up like lesbians, first of all, what's the lesbian disguise look like? I mean, is there like an official official lesbian costume. So,
Yeah.
but let's dress up like lesbians. I'm like, well, what am I supposed to look like? Don't I look like a woman? I mean, so let's dress up like lesbians, and we're gonna and do a certain sex act. And I was like, no. If I was a lesbian, she'd be a woman. She wouldn't have a penis, and she'd be really hot. So he was, I guess, hurt by this. But I believe that we can say no, and boundaries are okay and around intimacy and marriage. So for that, refusal to do some of the things he wanted, and because he continued to push the boundaries, always want to be effeminate in that regard, be dominated, be in a submissive kind of role in that. It was just not fun for me. And I finally just said, it's the same thing. I don't feel like you're into me. I feel like you're into some kind of fantasy, and this doesn't feel right. And I think feedback in marriage and on the intimacy stuff is appropriate, and that your feelings should be valued and respected, so that everyone's enjoying themselves and it feels respectful. And so I just wasn't feeling that. And because of that, that was held against me, and we lost intimacy because of that. But not only because of that, that therapist that we had seen in 1998, she actually wrote a letter right after that for him to go to the endocrinologist and start transitioning. So yeah, so he started hormone therapy while we were married, and he was on those pills for 11 years of our marriage behind my back. And so that affected his libido. So the things did shift. I thought it shifted because we had babies, because I, said no to certain things. And I think those did play a role, like they do in most relationships. And I accept ups and downs in that regard, but it was more than that. It was abnormal for the rest of the marriage. It was like, to the point where I was like, is there something wrong with me? Did I do something wrong? Am I unattractive to him now after having babies? And I was made to believe it was my fault for not being good enough, nice enough, being angry about the episodes of cross-dressing that happened intermittently in our marriage. So it was my fault. But the reality was he had a low libido, and he would have to stop taking those pills for a while so he would even have a libido. So how can you maintain the marital intimacy when someone is, number one, having secrets? I think having secrets interferes with your emotional intimacy that you have in a marriage anyway. And then the other part, you need to connect. They say you become one, and you physically need to do that once in a while. So he just, that was, in my opinion, is abusive.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. I think anyone who is not of that opinion needs to give their head a wobble, as the expression goes. There's lots of things, so many questions that I have for you. And they're not necessarily the questions that I thought I would have for you when we started this chat. Before we talk in more depth about your therapist, who sounds like the most horrendous human being, I just wanted to ask about this HRT. Okay, so the therapist refers him or whatever to start these feminizing hormones. Okay, presumably estradiol. And that explains his libido going absent. You said he'd been taking those pills behind your back for 11 years of your marriage. Now, so you hadn't noticed. So can I just ask, what exactly was going on there, aside from him no longer being able to get an erection to be intimate with you? What else actually happened?
Right. So I did notice some things. I just didn't know that he was on hormones. I did notice some breast development. He didn't develop full breast, but he did develop breast buds. There was nipple development, and they stuck out kind of like little tiny perky breasts. Imagine a 12 or 13-year-old girl. So it was unattractive, and I was not attracted to that. but I thought that was an accident that was related to taking OCD medication that he was on. And the OCD medication was prescribed for cross-dressing because one of the therapists that he saw along the way in our marriage, there were several therapists to try to address this issue of cross-dressing. And one said, well, you know, OCD medication will help you control your urges. And so he was taking that. We agreed he would do that. And then he just didn't want to take that medication anymore. And he said it was because of the breast development. And I mean, being so freaked out by the cross-dressing as it was, I was like, yeah, stop that. We don't want breasts in addition to anything else you might have, do that's temporary, because sometimes he'd grow his hair a little bit, like in a mushroom pixie cut type of thing, or remove some eyebrows, or he pulled all his knuckle hair off, which was weird. So, I was just freaked out and thought, sure, don't grow boobs. We don't want you to grow boobs. So I felt bad for him. He seemed embarrassed. He would wear a t-shirt when we went to the pool to try to, cover that. Of course, it couldn't cover it because it was sticking out. But I felt bad for him. This was something that I had to overcome whenever we did have the occasional intimacy. It's like, don't look at that. That's kind of gross. So, and again, I feel that's more than deceptive when someone is having a lesbian fantasy, engaging you in it, and you're not knowing that's what you're participating in, and you're, growing these breasts. Then, I mean, it's just really cruel and abusive in a underhanded kind of way that's not very overt, and tricking me to think like, oh, poor you. I guess I have to get used to your weird looking breast buds.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think you've endured abuse on so many levels, it's so, I can imagine how complicated it all must have been and how confusing when you're in that environment, surrounded by it every day. Lines are blurred, and you can't really see what's right in front of you, maybe because you're wrapped up in a family home, a family life, and trying to live up to certain promises that you made to one another. I think Mel's going to want to talk a bit about your therapist for sure. But, I was just kind of fixating on you should be more open-minded. That's the most horrifying thing I've ever heard. I can't believe someone in a professional capacity would say that to somebody, because, in a marriage, okay, intimacy is a big thing, and it's important that everyone's on the same page, but coercive sex, or just wrap your head around it, just give it a try for him. And it's completely against every natural instinct. I can't believe that was what your therapist said to you. Mel, what do you think about the therapist?
Well, I would have been so doubting myself every step of the way, because I'm being gaslit by my husband, who I think loves me, and he's lying, and my gut knows it, but I confused, right? And then the therapist is doing, again, to bring up cults, which I bring up quite often, but that is exactly what they do in a cult. They get you to shut off don't trust your gut feeling. Believe this. This is real. You're the problem. Anytime you feel uncomfortable, it's your fault. I mean, that is fucking cult 101. It's abuse, coercion 101. It's that person. I hope they don't have a license anymore. That's wrong.
She does.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure.
She has now written a book on how to support your child who's in transition.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. So we
she's
hate
helping
her,
parents
right?
transition their kids now. And she's still in practice. She even used to teach for years. This used to really piss me off, because I'd see these ads come up for these, like, there's something called leisure learning in Houston, where I live. And she was teaching a class there, how to have long and lasting relationships. And I thought, do you do it by lying? Is that what you tell them? So
you do it by saying all pain is for the greater good. You're just growing. Every time you don't feel right, it's making you better, stronger.
Yeah, I mean, it was like being taken to the high priest of the cult. It was going to this counselor who was going to, I guess, try to get me in line, and it didn't work. So we, had many more years together, and he would say,
can I ask
Yeah.
you 2 questions? What was the age of this therapist? I'm just trying to think. I'm just trying to get the vibe of like, it's late 90s. When did this person go to college? Where did they get their crazy ideas?
So I don't know her age right now, but I'm thinking she might be in her 60s right now. So back then she might have been late 50s. So, or no, early 50s or late 40s. So, because that was.
So she was sexual
Wait,
revolution,
no, longer
but
than that. That's longer ago. I'm getting my time confused, but I don't, she wasn't in her 20s. She was, she was
Mhm.
probably 40s, 50s. She seemed older than me. In fact, I really suspected this was a man.
because it had to have been somebody that was already immersed in what was already existing of gender studies.
Yeah,
An early adopter.
She did. She adopted all that because like her whole story's up on the internet about how she worked at some hospital and encountered the first ever person she knew of that identified as transgender, and I think it was a male wanting to be female. So she had this compassion for that person, but she has no compassion or empathy or understanding for anyone else's experience outside of that. And so I don't know if this was a male or a female, but the reason I suspected it was just because the way I was being gaslit, how strictly she was adhering to this ideology, and her presentation when I met her, she was talked very high and soft, which is what the men do when they're disguising their voice. And she had extremely long, thin legs and no butt. And she was just taller than your average woman. So there are a lot of things that made me suspect. But if she is really a man, I could never find any evidence of that because she's doing this very stealthily if she is. So she may honestly just be a professional handmaiden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that, because I know obviously this all kind of went down some time ago now. You've completely moved on in your personal life, and your world looks very different today. So I know that kind of reflecting too much on what happened back then isn't really it. I know that you want to bring a little bit of awareness as to that kind of that stealthy, these tactics that are, these underhanded manipulative tactics that people are being subjected to. I know you kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit more. So yeah, talk to me about that.
Right. So the second time, so that kind of goes to the second time I actually encountered this movement was when I was going through the divorce. So 2 kids later, let me just tap on that. Why did I have 2 more kids with this man? Because I believed him. Everyone wants to know, why'd you keep having sex with him? We didn't have sex that often because of the hormones, but we were married. I was in love with him. That's your answer. And we wanted to have more children together. And I always believed him. I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to do it again. Does it sound familiar? That's what happens in abusive situations. So we had 2 more children. I do not regret that. So we did end up divorcing after 15 years of marriage. I stumbled upon some conversations he was having with someone online, which indicated he was into sissy dom with this person. And I didn't even know that word at the time. So I just know that's what it was. And so it was obvious. That's when I found out about the hormones. It was in the messages that the hormones had been taken for 11 years. I had been seeing that therapist all this time. Many secrets I found in the messages. And so I filed for divorce in a different state. I was in Ohio at the time. And then when we went to family court, ultimately in Texas, because he moved us here, and they were trying to get me, his activist attorneys. He was with a law firm, which was started by Phyllis Frye. So in the United States, Phyllis Frye is who is referred to as the grandmother of the transgender rights movement. And he was tight with people like Martine Rothblatt, Reed Erickson, and Susan Stryker. So these were kind of your big billionaires, movers and shakers in that industry. Phyllis Frye, who was Philip Randolph Frye originally, just was a broke guy that came out of Texas A&M University, same school I went to. And but he's much older than me, and was like the first open transgender former cadet of their corps, like their military program at the university. And he eventually got a law degree, and he became an activist after he abandoned his first wife and son because of his cross-dressing problem, in which he admits in his memoir that he was engaging in like AGP, autogynephilic behavior. The way he describes, how did I conclude that? Basically, he was going through like a type of sex addiction therapy that required him to masturbate, cross-dress, masturbate, and throw up. So it was aversion therapy he says he was involved in to stop the cross-dressing. Well, this is obviously, if you're having to masturbate with your cross-dressing, then your cross-dressing was related to your masturbation. So I deduced from what he said in his book that he's an autogynephile. And he was mentioned masturbating and putting on like panties and stuff and other points of his memoir. So that's part of it. And so that's what I want to, point out. Like, this is not some innocent thing. Which is like, oh, I'm born in the wrong body, I just don't feel right. Yes, there's other reasons for dysphoria that are legitimate dysphoric, that are birthed out of trauma. And I'm not dismissing that. The answer is not to cross-dress. The answer is not to, pursue hormones and surgeries. So, and legal fake identities. So when I went, speaking of legal fake identities, by the time we got to court, he had already changed his sex identifier on his legal documents, like his Texas driver's license. And I don't know about his birth certificate. I didn't have access to that, but you can change everything in Texas. And so I was legally divorcing a woman in a state that didn't even, and in the United States, we didn't even have same-sex marriage yet. And so here I am divorcing a woman. We're both in court, and they're like, Mrs. Jones, and we would both stand up, so Jones wasn't our last name, just pretend it was Mrs. Jones. And so we both stand up. It was just very weird. We were like the sideshow there, but, lots of lawyers coming in to check out what was going on in that courtroom, just to get a peek at the transsexual, I guess. And looking at me up and down, this is something I think trans widows have to endure. Unfortunately, a lot of men think, oh, well, she was married to this guy and he was down for some really crazy stuff. So maybe she's down for some really kinky shit too. So, so there was a lot of weirdness later with dating, that men would think that there were boundaries I would be willing to cross that I was not, because I've been married to someone who did all this. So in court daily, we were in court for over a week, going through our dividing of assets, which we didn't have many, but mostly fighting over the custody of the children. And he had the activist attorneys just driving up the cost, dragging this on. And every day there was motions to make me use his preferred pronouns. So this is back in 2010, way before Bruce became Caitlin. And I'm thinking, this is unbelievable. Nobody's going to really try to make me do this. But there was this threat to try to hold me in contempt of court if I wouldn't use the new name and pronouns for someone who I had 3 kids with and was married to for 15 years. So that just shows you how far they had already come at that time, that they feel like they could do something like that even then. And now it would
in Texas, no less.
Texas is really where all this happened. I mean, Phyllis Frye was from here, and a lot of this stuff that went down was from here. If you want to know how the LGB adopted the T in the United States and took them on, that was Phyllis Frye that was Phyllis Frye's activism. It's right in his memoir where he used threats and bullying, and just like they do today, and threats of lawsuits. There were lawsuits and threats of like making people look bad in the media if you don't embrace the T and take on advocating for the T. He's the one that made ACLU and Human Rights Campaign take on the T. So I'm not an LGBT advocate by any means. That's their lane, but I've noticed that LGB wants to, depart from the T. If you want to do that, you need to read that memoir, and you need to do everything Phyllis Frye did to unwind that what he did, to tear down that legacy, because he used the LGB to get his way. He bullied everybody. And we see that same tactic today, the bullying and the threats and the lawsuits. And so, that's just my advice to the women who really want to get the T out of their movement, the lesbians. Look at what Phyllis Frye did, work on tearing down that legacy. That's what I'm trying to do in Texas, is tear down that legacy by getting our state to stop those legal sex identifier changes and the changing of all these documents, because that is the golden ticket. That's the golden ticket for these men to enter our spaces, all of our spaces, to get our opportunities where you have women own business opportunities, because we're less likely to own businesses. So there's grants and stuff that we can get as women to help us get our foot in the door. And there's sororities, there's business organizations, there's housing, prison, women's shelters, all these things. The golden ticket is getting that letter from a therapist, going to court and getting a court order to change all this. And there's numerous documents that are affected by this, and records and record keeping. Once you have a legal woman that's coming, legally a woman, and they're, enrolled in school as a female, this could be in the public school with the minors. We're having all these reports of males being in female locker rooms and bathrooms. So that's what I'm working on to try to stop here in Texas. And there've been like 4 states that have passed similar legislation. I want our legislation to have a little more teeth to it than that, and actually change sections of the code that the activist lawyer Phyllis Frye had used as a loophole. So we have to close those loopholes, and hopefully that'll be an example for other states what they need to do. Define sex in the law, but also change the safety and health code, change the state code where it refers to the family code. I think it's in the family code. Usually it's those two. And so you need to change that so that nobody can change their sex identifier unless it's to correct for biological, correctness, and consistent with what your biological sex is, as determined by your chromosomes, etc., all the science stuff. So instead of feelings. So back to the teeth of the movement and the just seeing how stealthily it moved. During that time that I was divorcing, my kids were ordered into court order therapy and sessions. And so for the purpose of which was to get them used to their father's new identity. So this is like re-education camp, basically state mandated re-education. In that therapy, which I had the privilege to pay at least half of, and I ended up paying for really most of it, because most of the time he wouldn't reimburse me, and I was the one that had to take the kids to some appointment. So $250 an appointment, I'm paying as a single mother who's already just barely over the poverty line at the time. And I'm paying for them to go to therapy and be told okay, we need to come up with a new name for what you're going to call your dad, because you can't call your father dad anymore. So they're coming up with a new name, and it can't be mom, because mom wouldn't like that. Their kids decided. I mean, I can't believe I had to pay for this bull crap. It's so hurtful to tell a kid that you can no longer call your father dad. So
It sounds like you really got screwed at every possible opportunity. You know, you're having
Yeah.
to address your ex-husband as she or Mrs. whatever in the court of law. Someone's trying to rationalize to you how, I did want to go into that a little bit more. How were the terms of your divorce ever worked out when you were divorcing a woman when you could never have legally married one in the first place? What how was that explained away to you? And then off the back of that, how do you end up paying money you don't have to re-educate your children? In other words, traumatize them. You must have been doing your best with that situation, but to have these weird conversations with your kids about, this is how you're going to talk to dad going forward. Well, not dad.
Yeah.
You just got burned at every single stage.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, tell me a little bit more about the divorce and how that was explained or worked out.
How old were your kids at the time also, before you dive into that?
So the time of the divorce, my kids were like in 6th grade, so like 11, and then I had a first grader, so 6 and 7, 6, 7, and 11. I mean, it kind of started prior to that, but when it finally finalized, that was our ages roundabout. So as far as how the divorce ended up on paper, it ended up because I was married to a man, and we argued about what the divorce decree would say. Would it say the new name or the old name? And right at the very last minute, when I already was beaten down, and I thought all the terms were settled, they bring this up, like, what name? And I'm like, it has to say the person I married. And then because I married, this person with the male name, and it is a man. I married a man. And so I was insisting on that. And at the very last second, when I'm already beat down, I was so depressed when they gave their ruling, because I was losing a bunch of time with my kids. I was only getting $500 a month child support for 3 children. And I was making I was only earning like a $13 an hour job at that time, because I hadn't worked in like 10 years. So I was just totally distraught and not really able to fight anymore. I was so run over. And so right at that time, can we add after they first had initially argued they were going to use just that name, his new name. And we'd already beat them back on that. And at the last second, because of child support, trying to make it like you're not going to get paid, you're not, the little bit you're going to get, and I know you need money, it's going to be hard to get you that. It's going to be a problem. No, it's going to be a problem for him, because it's going to out him. It's going to out him if he uses the male name in the orders. So, can't we at least put AKA instead of the child support order, which is different, would have the new name? I didn't understand at the time. I did understand later. The child support order would be written separately, could be redone with a new name. And so then he could go to a new job, which is what he did, and have a child support order. So when he went to HR, he'd be stealth. They wouldn't know this is a man at all when they had to do child support. So everyone thought this was a man who had a lesbian relationship and had children in that lesbian relationship. He told people he was the mother, people he would subsequently meet that didn't know me. He moved to a different state. He said he had a ex in Texas. We were lesbians, and we had these kids together through in vitro fertilization. I mean, the imagination is endless with this individual, but it is, as you see online, this is not just one. This is one of many examples of having a wild imagination, making up, stories, and simply not true. So that's how they did that. And as far as paying for therapy, I couldn't afford. We had a settlement of our assets, which we didn't have a whole lot. It was like less than $100,000. And that was divided, not right in half. I got a little bit more than he did, simply because he had accessed those assets before the divorce was final, to pursue things like his gender transit, to use for clothes, therapy, things related to his gender transitioning. So for that reason, I was awarded just a little bit more because he had already dipped into the community pot. And that's what I had to do. I had to access that money just to make ends meet for a while until I earned more money. So, and I had to pay a bunch of taxes anytime. So that was, drawn down pretty quickly in the first 2 years after my divorce, just trying to get on my feet. I had to rely on, the little bit of treasure that I had for me and my kids. But it's fine. We got on our feet. I made more money. After about 3 years, I got a better job, and things were financially stable. And then around 4 years after, I remarried and am doing way better financially. But not every woman has it that easy. And for me, it was very hard in those early years, getting 3 kids to school in the morning, different schools. Every kid went to a different school. All of this because somebody wanted to indulge their fetish and call it an identity and have it, and it's protected in law, and all of that, prioritizing that gender identity in the court, in the therapy sessions, that was all done really stealthily. There's nothing in law here that says that men can access women's restrooms, which my ex did, and men do all the time here in Texas. We actually tried to pass a bathroom bill in 2017, and we couldn't even get that passed because our Chamber of Commerce came up against that. So all these big businesses and outside businesses, big corporations from outside of our state threatened our governor and lieutenant governor, and they backed down. It's like, this should have been easy. I mean, you could simply write legislation that that would say, women's spaces are for women and men's spaces are for men. And the only exceptions to that are when you're helping somebody who's disabled and, needs help, or a minor child that has to be accompanied. So you could have written a bill. Everyone's like, well, what about, and what about, and what about? And Phyllis Frye was like, oh, there's the government code section that has to do with exposing yourself and has to do with assault. So we already have law for that. Like, yes, we have laws about indecent exposure. Yes, we have laws about sexual assault, but we still need to afford women the dignity of privacy and security when they're going out in public, and they're going to need a space to take down their pants and go to the restroom, and address feminine needs too. We don't need men in those spaces. I just can't believe that these men have been prioritized over women's needs. And when it comes to safety, I think I had it much better than most trans widows I've talked to, as far as like the nature of our relationship, which did get volatile towards the end, where we would argue about his phone because I wanted to see it. There was things on there he's hiding. And so there was like altercations about the phone. And one time I wanted to get one of my kids out of the house. I was leaving and he wouldn't let me take one of the children, one of the babies. And so I was distraught and trying to get up the stairs. I don't remember anything beyond I wanted to get past him on the stairs, and he blocked the stairs and pushed me down the stairs. So I was left with a knot on my head. Did I call the police? I did not call the police. I did not report that. I never even mentioned it in the court stuff, and I had forgotten, like everything else. I just put it behind me. I had to move on and take care of my kids. And most of these women endure much more abuse. But what if I had fought back, really? What if we really had, what if we really had a bad altercation between us and I defended myself? That's what my concern for the women who are in these really abusive relationships with these kind of men. When you put these protections like our government in the United States wants to put in, they want to amend the Equal Rights Act to protect gender identity. But this is going to really hurt the women who are in abusive situations with these men. Because a lot of these men really hate their wives. My ex had a whole journal, for example, of the things he didn't like about me that he kept over the years. Just what a rotten person I am. And some of it was probably true. I don't know, because when I read it, I was like, I don't remember this. I don't remember. I didn't realize you hated me so badly. But it's because I was in his way. I was in the way.
I was going to say, whatever's going on with his psychology, to frame you in a way that, it affirms to him that you're not good enough, or there's an excuse for what he is doing to you. yeah, it's likely that things were just fabricated, but I mean, you could be a pretty terrible wife to him. It's still a bit weird. He's keeping a journal about it. It's like, where's the normal communication between partners?
I would give myself a B as far as being a wife. I mean, I wouldn't give myself an A. I made mistakes. I'm a humble person. I'm not going to say I didn't make mistakes, but there definitely, I tried to be a perfectionist as well. I tried to eliminate the possibility that I was responsible for any of this. And that was very stressful. But no one deserves to have the whole, journal keeping about them, how much, they hate you. And then they go behind your back and get somebody else and tell them how much they hate you. And all because really I was in the way of him, this dream he had, that he just really wanted to feminize. He wanted to grow his hair out and stuff. And all of that just, I feel like the women who are encountering or married to men like this, they may be encountering abuse because of that. And then we have the government coming in and going to protect these men. And so what happens? I think this is a bad situation for the women, because if they strike back, they're going to be they could be gaslit into striking back, and they can then end up being put in prison for a felony charge of domestic violence. So,
well, and the husband could go into that same jail and just continue to torment her if we're going to really,
or the women's shelter. The women, my ex actually, after he left me, in his next relationship, he did have actual domestic violence, and he was not the perpetrator of that. It was the female to male on testosterone that he was with. And she threatened to kill him, threatened to kill the kids, threatened to kill me. And that was one of the reasons I was able to modify the court order, so he couldn't see the kids as much and couldn't make as many decisions. But part of that order was that he would go to domestic violence. It was like, I think it was for battered women. I mean, there's a man going to be going to the battered woman's class. I mean,
this is making me think of something else, because I bring up the cult thing a lot, but something that we don't talk about a lot, and maybe we've mentioned it before, but this is all really making me now think of addiction, because you were in the way of his addiction, and the way an addict would, sooner stab you in the eye so that they can get out the door than have you stop them from going to get a fix, right? And that makes me wonder, would an intervention even fucking work? That just popped into my head. But anyway,
I wanted an intervention. One of the therapists that he went to did say this was like a sexual addiction. And I, as hard as that is as a wife to hear, because that sounds really scary. Oh my gosh, a sex addict, and you want to go to Sex Addicts Anonymous. He didn't ever go to the Sex Addicts Anonymous that he was supposed to go to, the therapist wanted him to go to. I was really nervous about him meeting a bunch of sex addicts. I'm like, this sounds dangerous. A bunch of sex addicts in one room. This is before Zoom. But I would say that the experience that the families have with this is very familiar to what a family experiencing alcohol addiction with a family member is. And it can affect everybody a little differently. You may have a family member that's scapegoated, and you'll have all these different, you'll have someone who becomes OCD, perfectionist, you'll have all those ways that people kind of deal with that in their families. And I think that we need to try to understand the effects on the family in that type of framework, and that counselors need to, and church leaders who do counseling as well, for people of faith, need to address this in that framework as far as how it affects the family. And we don't have that. We don't have that professionally in a field that prioritizes gender identity and doesn't recognize the true harm and the downstream carnage that's happening because of this affirmation of something that's completely false. This trans identity. I say trans is not real. And because it isn't, it's something that is being just weaponized just to hurt. It seems like it hurts everything it touches. It just hurts everything it touches. And this happens so stealthily. in the United States without law. I mean, we have a few states that have protections in the law and have, passed different ordinances in different states. But even before that, use Texas as an example. We don't have that. We didn't have that in the county where I got divorced. It was a very conservative county. I had a Republican judge. So in the US, that's a conservative. And just all this has been done really stealthily, where everyone, they're bullied, the organizations, the institutions, everyone's bullied into doing this. And it's in the schools very stealthily. Parents, so no, there's no policy. There's no policy on purpose. And our local schools here, where I have a conservative school board where I live, and the policy, there's no policy. There's no policy that says where trans identifying students use the restroom, for example. But they are deciding this on a case-by-case basis. The reason for that, and the guidance by there's an organization called the Association of School Boards. In Texas, it's Texas Association. There's a national group, National Association of School Boards. Well, they give legal advice to the schools. So they say, don't have a policy. Then you can avoid the confrontation, the conflict and problems, and all that publicity. So don't have the policy. Instead, case-by-case basis, because if there's a policy, that's just one of the ways they do it. By not having a policy, they can have an unofficial policy, and the parents will never know about it. They put in all this social emotional learning in our schools, which has a purpose of like teaching self-regulation, like emotional regulation. So, and that's good. Everyone can stay on task. We can control our emotions and respect each other, but they extend that into, well, like, respect their pronouns, respect this person's identity. And so you're getting really personal with kids. And then once they validate somebody's phony identity, this is like a psychological treatment for the child. When you start affirming this lie, and they become more rooted in that, and it's hard to get them to desist. So then they're on the pathway for the gender clinic. So the whole infrastructure is in our schools. It's built in with all these interventions they have with the kids and their community time. They've got programs like the Anti-Defamation League as part of their social emotional learning. Anti-Defamation League, I don't know if that's in anywhere other than the United States, but here they push the gender ideology, and they're anti-Christian, they're anti-parent, and there's a lot of entities like that, non-government organizations, nonprofits, and some of them just vendors that are getting in our schools, and the parents have no idea. And there's laws like in my state and in the nationally, there's things that you can keep from the parents. So if they're more and more having clinics and access to your children for mental health in our schools, they keep pushing, mental health, it's so important, especially after the pandemic. I mean, billions of dollars are being spent on mental health and pushed towards our schools. And I think mental health is important, but they're supplanting like things that used to always work in our community, such as parental involvement, the church involvement, strong community connection. Instead, everything's being, put down mental health. Well, all these mental health professionals are pushing like total pseudoscience, like the genderbread person. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the genderbread person. So, I mean, I can't believe we take anybody seriously that calls himself a doctor and is pushing this crap. But I found training in my state to these people that we were spending $200 million on. And that was just to get started. We've now doubled down, and we're spending, or more than doubled down, we're spending like $1 billion in the next 2 years on mental health for our schools through this program. And kids access this program. They get their parents say one time in the beginning of the year when there are signing forms, when they send home like 70 forms that you sign, and you say, yes. Oh, if there's an emergency, yes. Oh, can they, if they find out your kid needs counseling, yes, because you don't want to look like the bad parent, so you feel coerced. I know as someone who was a single parent, and actually, I was eligible for services, meaning I was low income. We were on the reduced lunch program. So they consider those kids at risk already. And any kid in a divorce situation is at risk. So they identified one of my kids as being at risk, asked me, would I let my kid do this counseling? I did. And they were so weird. They were passing around a teddy bear. And my kid's like in middle school, 12 years old, and they passed around the teddy bear. He was so embarrassed. I mean, and then trying to get them to share personal things and be vulnerable with other kids in a circle was just very uncomfortable for him. So I took him out, but I felt coerced. And I think a lot of parents who are in that position, especially like minority parents, poor parents, they feel like, oh, the school thinks my kid needs something and they think I'm not giving it to them or not able to, then if I don't prove it, that I'm giving that, then they are going to try to take my kids away, because most of those interactions with social services is with those minority populations and the poor families. And that doesn't mean they're guilty of abuse, but they just get more interactions and they have their kids taken away. And a lot of times, unnecessarily, and then they can experience abuse and they experience trauma from being separated from parents who may not be doing anything wrong, but a social worker came out and maybe didn't like your ideology at your house, or maybe you hadn't been grocery shopping and when they looked in the refrigerator it wasn't really full, or or maybe there weren't you're poor, so all the clothes don't fit your kids perfectly. These are reasons that they might, want to take your kids away. So avoiding those investigations is always the best for parents. And because it violates due process anyway. So there's ways to find out if someone is experiencing abuse without being this intrusive and violating and use due process. And so for me, I have really concerns for that population, the way they do that. And they're using this, with this ideology in there, knowing that if their kids are saying, well, I'm non-binary, and the parents are like, well, non-binary is bullshit. I mean, this may constitute abuse. And actually, what I found when I went to my state house to testify, and I watched the testimonies of several social workers in our state testify against the ban on puberty blockers and surgeries for minors, social worker after social worker was for all of this. And several said, oh, we have helped sever the rights of parents. And this is in Texas. So there's a famous case, the Jeff Younger case in Texas, where his son was taken away. He's been taken to California, which is like a sanctuary state for child transition. And the mother has been transitioning him since he was really little, because he wanted a My Little Pony toy at the, in his Happy Meal box or something like that. So that's a famous case that happened here. We've known about this problem for so long and haven't done anything in the law to really protect a parent's rights. It's one thing to say you cannot transition this kid, but this mom just took her kid to another state. The court enabled it. Why? Because the court's in agreement with this ideology. They prioritized the ideology that because the dad wasn't in agreement and wasn't using the name and the pronouns, well, then he was ordered into court-ordered therapy, which he didn't want to pay for and go to. And so as a result, oh, you're not acting in the best interest of your kids. So I'm going to go ahead and grant the permission for the ex-wife to take your kid to California, which is, by the way, a sanctuary state for what she really wants to do to her kid. So, and she dresses the kid like a little hooker. That's how she dresses him. And so it's just all very weird, but we could have put protections in our family code to prevent that from happening. So if the dispute is over gender identity or providing modification procedures to the child, then both parties have to remain in the state until the kid is an adult. We actually have in our code, usually both have to stay in the same county that they divorce in until the one who's not the primary moves. If the person who's not primary moves, then the person who is primary has permission to move at that point. But the idea is to try to keep the kids close to both parents initially. So we do have that. We don't have a perfect code by any means. It cuts both ways and hurts people, but we could have protected children from being taken out of state. It's not like our government didn't know, but this is just another way the courts and the counselors were all in agreement. And because we don't have laws addressing this, it's really sad, because now things that we never would have had to have in writing before, like common sense stuff, we have to have in writing to protect women and to protect children, really to protect all of our rights, because nobody should be compelled, have their speech compelled like they were trying to do to me. Nowadays, that would happen. My judge at the time didn't go along with it. She wasn't the sharpest. She was like, well, how do you feel about that? Like, we'll just leave it up to me if I, come on, you're a judge. How about we abide in the truth when we're in a court of law? How would we do that? Instead, she asked me, even while I was feeling run over, like, how do you feel about that? I was like, well, I feel like the people who are asking us to be really tolerant of them are not, being very tolerant of me. I'm divorcing someone I was married to 15 years and I had babies with. It's a man. I don't want to be, forced. So I ultimately was not forced at that time. But nowadays, what do you think will happen? I mean, and Jeff Younger is not the only one who's lost his kid. There are mothers that have testified in our state house saying that they had their child's, had their ex-husband's rights terminated because they didn't affirm their child's gender identity and didn't agree to the procedures. So this isn't a one-off case by any means, because every institution that you have to interact with as a citizen is in agreement with this. And if you ask them, this is what bothers me as a trans widow has been super gaslighted. They're like, no, it is. No, we don't have a policy on that. We're not doing that. We're not keeping secrets, when they really are. So it's very gaslighting. And the way to ensure that they're not doing that is to get the policy in place. So if you're not doing it, no problem. It's not going to hurt anybody to have a policy about the bathroom. It's not going to hurt anybody to have a policy that when you're enrolled in our school, it needs to be according to your birth certificate at or near the time of birth, instead of a modified birth certificate, which would have a later date on there. So that's an example of how this was done very stealthily. It's been done on purpose without changing the law. So we didn't even go through a democratic process. Women were never asked. So we were just denied, again, our right to even vote on the matter. And it affects us more than anybody. I don't want to undermine the point that this does affect everyone. And people have a problem, especially in the United States, of getting involved and acting on issues until it does hit their front door. But I'm going to tell you, do not wait. Do not wait till this affects your family member or you. It's your wife, your son, your daughter, your mom, your brother, because this is going to affect you. This is going to affect you whether you realize it or not, because it's going to violate your parental rights. It's going to violate your free speech, maybe your freedom of religion too, because once there's protections in place, just look at what has been happening in UK, Canada, and Australia. So this is a warning. Any US people watching this, you need to get out of your comfort zone and talk to your legislators and say, I expect you to get out of your comfort zone and protect us from this radical trans ideology, because it's in conflict with the truth, and you cannot have justice, you cannot have liberty if you're not anchored by the truth.
That was an amazing little wrap up there. That was really powerful, and you're such a good speaker.
Fucking great.
No, really, I just think you're amazing. What you've managed to draw from the horror show that you were put through for such a long time.
The whole thing about the parents with the schools and the paperwork that's coming home, it's so crazy, because even if they were to read everything verbatim, they're not including everything. That's people, if anyone does plan to take action, you have to come up with questions that you don't even know what the question is that you need to be asking, because everything's so hidden. Anyway, that's just something to keep in mind, because even maybe a parent thinks, well, I've got my eye on the ball here. And it's like, well, double check.
Yeah, you don't know. Just because you consent in the beginning of the year, there could be a lot of interactions with your kid, especially in the health clinics. depending on how all this, and there's also so many ways they are interacting with your kid on behavioral health and mental health. So those interventions, you might know about them, but you don't know, you might know that you've agreed to a few sessions. You don't know what's going on. There's reasons in the law that allow a provider to keep a secret from a parent. And that includes if that provider thinks that it may be emotionally or mentally distressing to the patient. So imagine they identify as non-binary or the opposite gender, and therefore they, and the parents don't agree with that kind of stuff. And so they report to the provider, oh, my parents will just kill me, then there's going to be the likelihood that they're going to not tell the parents about this. And basically you are administering a treatment when you agree with that identity that the kid is putting forward at the school. And you don't know in that health clinic that you think, oh, we got for free. You don't know that what the operating procedures are in that clinic. You may know that you consented and they provide certain services and all that sounds really good and free. I mean, so the price is too high. I mean, it sounds like it's free, but in reality, the price is too high. They are separating us from our kids in another, just another way they're separating us from the kids. They're acting as if the kids are just on loan to us for nights and weekends. And our only duty here is to make sure the kids get a good night of sleep and a little bit of fun on the weekends. And my kids, I had to work. It was expensive, difficult for me to leave work as a low-income single mother, but those were times I was there for my kid. I made sure I knew what the doctor said. I knew and I consented to everything that was happening there instead of a possible secret. So you're removing another layer, actually the best layer of safeguarding that there could be for a child in almost every case. That is being removed by removing the parent and putting this in an area where it's at the school, so it's convenient, and more of us parents would be more likely to say, okay, I trust, because you want to trust because it's convenient. And no one wants to see these things. No one wants to see this. I think that's, if you ask a trans widow, how did you stay so long? How did you put up with all that? Like, my ex tried to breastfeed my daughter. How did I stay? Because you don't want to see this. And I'm asking the world to see this, see it for what it is, because you are going to lose your rights. You are going to lose your children, whether your kid transitions or not. They are going to adopt this ideology, and you are going to be a closed-minded bigot, just like that therapist was trying to tell me I was years ago. And you care about your kids? Oh, well, caring about your kids, that's just old-fashioned values. Not wanting them to be on chemicals for the rest of their lives, not wanting them to butcher their bodies in a way where they won't be able to enjoy breastfeeding and do the most healthy thing for their baby if they're able, and they won't be able to enjoy a sex life to the fullest because they may not ever be able to orgasm, as we know from that Marcy Bowers. I mean, at least he, because Marcy Bowers is a he, did admit that. That's one favor that that one radical gender ideologist did for us.
If I may just ask a very brief question, and then we will let you go, because I'm sorry we've kept you too long and we kept you waiting to begin with. I just wanted to ask you if you could just give us your unique perspective. All of us listening to your story today understand why you stayed. You were in love, you were a family unit, you believed a lot of what you were being told, and of course hindsight is a marvelous thing, and you're putting that to very good use. So I wondered what your advice would be to any women who are watching or listening in who might find themselves in such a situation where their husband has these behaviors and it isn't sitting right for her. She does not want to indulge. She doesn't want to facilitate or be a part of it. What would your advice to those women be?
I would say trust your gut. I didn't trust my gut. And so a lot more things happened that would have been prevented when my husband was still in the home with me and my daughter, and she was just 4 or 5. He actually took one of her bows and was wearing it. So it made me realize, like, the way I feel violated, that he's been in my clothing and in my underwear, she might also feel violated. And I don't want that for my kids. So ultimately, my advice is leave. I know that I'm very much recognize the harm of divorce, especially for children. You know when where your finish line is. And so if you can't leave yet because you're not at that finish line, financially prepare and do things to protect yourself now, because these men have a wide network of support when they're ready to leave you, and you're not going to find that. So if you don't have children, I absolutely would say get out of there before it's too late. I don't think that a lot of these men can be helped. If you can do the research on narcissism yourself, this is very prevalent with narcissism, and most narcissists are not cured. And I think the stats for sex addicts are not very good either. So before it's too late, and it's more difficult to get out because there are children, I would get out. And if you do have children, it's a little stickier situation, but I don't recommend staying. I recommend carefully and safely getting out with support of your family, your church, and community. So work on that support because you're going to need it. And I would encourage people who know someone in this situation, a woman, to do more to support them so they can safely leave and not experience all the trauma that going into poverty. I was left homeless with 3 kids when it happened to me. So we do need to support these women. That means, being there for them to, help them get legal advice and legal representation, be there emotionally for them, financially help them get on their feet, help them get a decent job that works with their children, that can help them swing everything, because they're going to have a lot on their plate and very little support. And don't back off from these women. I experienced such a desert when it came to friends. Everyone left. My support left. All I had left was my family, and no one knows how to support women like this. So don't just say, how can I help you? Let me know if I can help you. Help her. She needs your help. Somebody left a bag of groceries on my front door one time. I'll never forget it. It's probably one of the hugest, nicest things anyone ever did. It was when I had $8 in my bank account and I had just been to the grocery store, and I had to say no to my kids on certain things they wanted to get because my situation just changed so suddenly. And these men do financially control their women. And so they're going to financially be in need when they're trying to escape and get out of that. So recognize that this emotionally, mentally, for the trans widow, it's very similar to going through being a victim of domestic violence or being a battered woman. So they need your help on the way out. They've been gaslighted. They're believing things about themselves. They need your help to challenge that and face reality. Like we want to believe our exes. We want to believe the things they've said, the bad things about us and the good things about them. And so we need some help challenging some of that disordered thinking that we take on as a result of being gaslighted for so long. So we need help when we're escaping that. So please keep that in mind if you're somebody who's in the circle of a trans widow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That sounds like solid advice.
Thank you so much. Do you have anything that you need to plug?
You can just go to my Twitter for now at Ask a Trans Widow.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much. This was really informative, and I mean, obviously you're thriving now, and you're an amazing powerhouse of a woman.
Thank you. I think you guys are great. Thanks for having me on, and I appreciate what you're doing. I love the name of the show.
It is Ma'am.
Yeah, that's a very cute. We all know what it's referring to. I mean, we know that in the United States and across the sea, we know. So it's
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Tracy. You take care. We'll see you on Twitter.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It is man